Jai Hind, Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we'll be discussing selected topics from the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 30th of September, right? In this video, we'll be discussing the following topics. Amnesty shuts shop in India. So I will tell you why Amnesty International is running away from India. It is wrongly blaming the government of India. What is the real reason? And the history of Amnesty in India. Then the second nationwide Sero survey. So the results of second nationwide Sero survey are out, and it says that only 7% of population in India was affected by coronavirus in August. So we are still far away from any sort of herd immunity. So we'll see about the results of this survey. Then another Chinese drama claims LAC of 1959. So the Chinese are now turning into comedians, but dangerous comedians. They are every day coming up with new claims, and they are really crazy people. So I'll tell you what are the claims of 1959, what are India's claim on LAC, and China has also said that we do not recognize the UT of Ladakh. So I will tell you why they are saying so. Then after the Vodafone verdict, Kern seeks 1.4 billion. So Kern is another British company, and under the India-UK BIT, it says that it has protection, and it was also subjected to retrospective tax demand by Indian authorities, and has also filed the case in the same arbitration tribunal, and it is seeking 1.4 billion in damages. So we'll look at this case as well. Then Serum Institute of India commits to make 100 million more vaccine doses. So earlier it had committed to making 100 million vaccines for middle and low income countries. So now 100 million more. So we'll look into it. We'll also look into Gavi Coax, right? Then Green Strategic Partnership between India and Denmark. So we'll see what is this Green Strategic Partnership all about. And then we'll also have a brief look at the India-Denmark relationship. Then another day in 2020, another bad news, Congo fever reported from some areas in Maharashtra. So we will discuss what is Congo fever and some points about it. Then the perils of state overreach. So this is basically an editorial from the Hindu, and it is talking about the implications of the Vodafone verdict. So no personal opinions here, some good points. So that is why I have included this here. Then managing the global common. So in this article, I'll just introduce you to the concept of global common and its management, some little concept, nothing much. This is also an editorial from the Hindu. So these are all the things that we are going to discuss in this video. Now let's get started. Amnesty shuts shop in India. So Amnesty International is an NGO based in UK, and it also conducts its operations in India under the name Amnesty India. Now it says that it works on the field of human rights. Now why has it shut its shop? Because the government of India has frozen all its bank account. Now why so? Because Amnesty was not following FCRA regulations, right? There were many financial irregularities in the conduct of Amnesty, and it was illegally getting money into India from its parent organization in the name of FDI. Now which NGO gets FDI? I really don't know. So they are running a scam, and it is not the first time that they have had to shut shop. Even in 2009, they had to exit India because again, they were in violation of FCRA. As a matter of fact, they have not registered themselves under FCRA. And this NGO or so-called NGO has been involved in spreading fake news, spreading fake narratives. And when it has been called out with proofs, it has failed to, or it has just not cared enough to apologize. So India has a policy as a sovereign country. We do not let any foreign power or any NGO or organization funded by foreign powers to meddle in our internal affairs. And Amnesty says that its latest two reports, one on abrogation of 317 Kashmir and the human rights violation, and the investigation, the bossed up investigation of Delhi police into the Delhi riots, where it has blamed government of India. It says that these reports were the reasons why government of India went after it, but this is not true, because like I said, in 2009, they had to shut shop. They were in contravention of FCRA. Again, in 2012, they were part of the larger NGO gang that was protesting against the Kudankulam power plants in Tamil Nadu. Now, there was also a big controversy behind that, because Kudankulam nuclear power plant was a Russian plant, and companies of the West like US and UK based companies, they were paying money to these so-called NGOs to raise protests and ensure that this plant does not operate in India. So basically, by getting money from abroad, they are running their own propaganda and narratives. They are also engaging in things like spreading fake news, like I said, and they never have apologized for any of their actions, and they plainly refuse to be covered under FCRA, and they are swindling people and they are getting money from outside in the name of FDI. Now you tell me which NGO is supposed to get FDI? So that is why CBI initiated an inquiry against it, and under that inquiry, the ED froze its accounts. Now, Government of India and MHA, which is the nodal ministry for FCRA, I have told you time and again, it has said that Amnesty is free to conduct its humanitarian operations in India. There is no problem. And basically, Government of India has not banned Amnesty. Please pay attention. It is Amnesty who has chosen to shut its shop in India because of, it says, lack of funds. Now, if you really want to do social service, you don't need funds. You just need to have that spirit of doing the social service. But this organization is not at all interested in social service. They are just interested in conducting a business. So let's see what all of this is all about. So it blamed Government of India for freezing all of its accounts, and that forced it to halt its operations in the country. Now, what is Amnesty International? Like I said, a so-called NGO which is headquartered in the UK, and it says it focuses on human rights. Now, what is happening? The ED froze all the bank accounts of this organization. Why did the ED take such an action? Because they were getting foreign monies, almost 4 million or 36 crore rupees they got from their parent organization in the UK in the name of FDI. But they are supposed to be registered under FCRA and nobody is above law, right? And what they did is really startling. They made 4 fictitious companies and they got money on those companies to beat the rules in India. So those 4 entities that got registered in India are Amnesty International Foundation, Amnesty International Health Private Limited, Amnesty International South Asia Foundation, and Indians for Amnesty International Trust. Now see, this is what happens. They conduct scams in India, and when you call them out, then they play the victim card. And they say that government is fascist and whatnot, but they are not ready to basically follow the laws. Why not register under FCRA and get your fundings? They simply refuse to get registered. So this malified rerouting of money was in contravention of the exact legal provisions, that is, they have to be registered under FCRA. Now, what is FCRA? We have discussed this in detail in so many videos. So FCRA is Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. Any NGO or organization which is receiving money from abroad has to be registered under this act, and they have to file a yearly return to continue receiving the funding. And it's a very simple form for those who are doing genuine work. For those who are swindling money or conducting scams and doing whatnot in name of running an NGO, they find it difficult. So it is a law under which NGOs receive international funding in India, and the Union Home Ministry is the nodal ministry. So what is Amnesty saying? Amnesty saying that it is a witch hunt for its work in India. It referred to its report on alleged human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir due to abrogation of Article 370 and the Delhi police investigations into the February riots. Both the reports criticized Government of India and blamed it for human rights violations. I've already told you. Now, what is the stand of Government of India? Government of India is very, very clear about its stand. It says that Amnesty International is in clear contravention of Indian law, and human rights cannot be an excuse for defying law of the land. You just can't say, right, that I am a harbinger of human rights and I'm a foreign NGO, so I do not follow your laws. If you're operating in India, you have to follow the law of the land. India, by settled law, does not allow interference in domestic political debates by entities funded by foreign donations. For example, this Amnesty International, it made a submission before a US Congressional Commission which was looking into the alleged human rights violations in J&K after abrogation of 370. Now, neither does US nor does Amnesty International have any business in what happens in India, right? We do not concern ourselves what US is doing in Guantanamo Bay, what they did in Iraq, what they did in Afghanistan. We never ran any committees. So seriously, as a principle of sovereignty, we shouldn't care, and we should not care what these white people think of us anymore. So is the action restricted to the present government? Like I said, no. In 2009, they shut their shop, right? And then again in 2012, Dr. Manmohan Singh made a statement about NGOs meddling in India's affairs. And this was in reference to the role of NGOs in Kudankulam protests. I've told you what that protest was all about. Now, is this the first time Amnesty has had to shut shop in India? No, it did so in 2009 as well, but then it came back. Now, Amnesty has had very strange bedfellows. They are not the saints they claim to be. In 2010, they were actively collaborating with Muazzam Beg, who is a former Guantanamo Bay detainee and is often described as Britain's most famous supporter of the Taliban. And basically, Mahatma Gandhi's grandniece, she was working with them. She came to know about it, she raised her voice, and she was fired from this organization. So Amnesty has also in the past peddled fake news and propaganda and has refused to apologize when called out. So this is the arrogance they have because they think that they are above the Indian laws. Now, is Amnesty International being singled out by Government of India? Again, no. CBI is conducting larger inquiries into many foreign NGOs that I've told you before as well. That more than 20 international NGOs, including Greenpeace, Compassion International, and Ford Foundation, over the past few years have been under the scanner of CBI. Some of them are running fake propaganda, some of them are supporting forced conversions, and some of them are trying to meddle in our affairs. So there are a lot of lobbies that are at work. So CBI is conducting its inquiry and looking at the trail of the finances from where they come and what they're doing in India. So Amnesty is not the only one that is being targeted by Government of India, and it is now simply playing a victim card. Because if its funds are frozen, it could have gone to the Supreme Court to get its rights enforced or its funds restituted, but they know that they stand on a weak wicket, and that is why they are just shutting their operation and they are playing victim. The right course should have been that they should have approached the courts, and all the so-called human rights activists and the lawyers, they would have fought their case pro bono, that is without charging any fees, right? But they all know that they are at fault. That is why they are doing all this drama. So a good step by Government of India. Second nationwide Sero survey. So ICMR second nationwide Sero survey is out. The first survey was conducted for the month of May and it gave a figure of 0.73%. That 0.73% of Indian population was having antibodies in their blood that suggested that they had been exposed to the virus. Now the figures for August, they say that around 7% of India's adult population. So that's a tenfold, almost a tenfold increase in the numbers that have been exposed to the virus. Now, basically I'll tell you what is Sero survey. So Sero survey is nothing. We do a blood test and we look for antibodies in the blood. Antibodies are what? This is a response that is generated by your white blood cells when a virus infects you. So our body tries to fight back and they produce antibodies to fight these viruses. For COVID-19, the antibody that we look for in the blood is IgG. So tests were conducted and basically the same sample was subjected to test as was in the case of first sample. So the figures are much more reliable, right? So let us look at it. As per ICMR survey, 60 million Indians may have been exposed to virus. Around 7% of India's adult population may have been exposed to the novel coronavirus till the last fortnight of August. Points to a tenfold jump in infection since May as per the results of the first Sero survey. Now what is a Sero survey? Like I told you, it is an antibody test conducted on a sample of population to assess how many people have been affected. And how is it done? By detecting in blood presence of specific antibodies produced against the virus. I've told you this. So for COVID-19, we look for IgG that appear within 2 weeks of an infection. Now the problem is that presence of IgG only tells that a person has been exposed to coronavirus. It does not tell that whether that person is still suffering from the disease or not. So because it is yet unclear how long antibodies detectably persist in the body, their presence only indicates past exposure to and not presence of the virus. So what do the numbers signify? The numbers signify that we have still not achieved herd immunity. As a matter of fact, we are far away from it. Now what is herd immunity? Herd immunity basically means that a large proportion of our population has been exposed to a disease and they have developed antibodies in their bodies or in their blood against that disease. Now the figures can vary from 50 to 90% depending on the disease. So we are still at 7% in terms of antibodies. So we are a long way away from achieving any kind of herd immunity. That is why it is important that we continue to practice social distancing and all other norms that have been given out by Government of India. Another Chinese drama claims LAC of 1959. So Chinese have come up with a new trick because they are crazy people. So now they are saying that we do not recognize the UT of LAC and we are doing whatever we are doing to reclaim our land as per the LAC of 1959. Now this is a map, you can take a screenshot. I've discussed this before as well. Why they don't want to recognize the UT of Ladakh. See, this is our UT of Ladakh, right? This whole area is our UT of Ladakh. Now compare this with this map. This region is the Aksai Chin region, right? And from here, like I always tell you, the China National Highway 219 runs and it connects Xinjiang with Tibet, right? So this is a very important road for China. Secondly, here is the Shaksgam Valley. Shaksgam Valley is the place that Pakistan had ceded to China in 1963. And from here runs the CPEC. I have shown you the map of CPEC, how it runs through Gilgit-Baltistan, and from there it runs through the whole of Pakistan. So if China were to recognize this UT of Ladakh, that means all of its strategically important areas would actually be illegal. So now they have come up with a new drama that we are reclaiming the land that was agreed as per the LAC of 1959. Now the question arises, what is the LAC of 1959? Basically in 1959, the then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai made a proposal to Pandit Nehru about drawing up an LAC and exchange of lands. Pandit Nehru never accepted it and subsequently no government of India ever accepted it. I have told you earlier as well, the LAC that we recognize is the LAC as per the agreement we signed in 1993 when our then Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao visited Beijing. So under that agreement, the LAC referred to basically the LAC as it was existing on that date in 1993. So there's no question of LAC of 1959, no question of LAC of 1962, only we agree to the LAC of 1993, and LAC is not the final border because for India, LAC is only a working border till the time we don't get to a permanent solution, and China is not interested in a permanent solution. So let us see what this article is saying. Beijing says does not recognize the UT of Ladakh. I just told you why. This was a statement made by the Foreign Ministry that it was honoring the LAC of November 7, 1959. Now what is the LAC of 1959? It was first referenced in a letter from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai to Jawaharlal Nehru. The idea was rejected by Nehru and subsequently never accepted by India. What is India's stand on LAC? Like I said, only agreed to LAC in 1993 when P.V. Narasimha Rao visited Beijing, and the LAC referred to was the LAC of 1993, not 1959 or 62. India sees LAC as a working border till a final solution is found. So this is the new Chinese drama, but even if they were talking about the LAC of 1959, still they are in violation of that LAC because they have made deep incursions which are 8 to 10 kilometer beyond the LAC of 1959. So Chinese are basically contradicting their own stance, but as we know they are crazy, so they can say anything. So let's see how this drama unfolds. After Vodafone verdict, Cairn seeks 1.4 billion. So Cairn is basically a British oil major, just like Vodafone is a British telecom company. So this also concerns to BIT, India UK BIT, and Cairn also says that it suffered from heavy losses because of retrospective tax demand that was levied by Indian tax authorities. And as a matter of fact, this is the second biggest case involving BITs and the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, where this company has also filed a case against India, right? Now it is hoping that the tribunal will decide in its favor and they are seeking $1.4 billion in damages from India. Now this comes on the heels of another judgment by the International Arbitration Tribunal which said that India should back off from claiming 22,000 crores from Vodafone in terms of retrospective tax, right? And that involved the BIT between India and Netherlands, and this involves the BIT between India and UK. Later on, we'll discuss an editorial from Hindu, and then we'll see that what are the significance or the consequence of the Vodafone verdict for India. SII commits to making 100 million more vaccine doses. So we have already covered an article in previous videos where SII had made a commitment of making 100 million vaccines for middle and lower income countries, but it was not clear whether the vaccine would be one shot or two shot, and the price range was between $2 and $3. Now it has added 100 more to that, so that makes total 200 million vaccines. Now how is it getting the fund? It is getting funding under the Gavi COVAX, which is a global fund with funding from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is funding this development of COVID vaccine. So let's just go through the news, what it is saying. So the Pune-based Serum Institute of India committed to producing an additional 100 million doses of the vaccine it is testing. With this, a total of 200 million doses will be available at $3 each to a group of at least 61 low and middle income countries, including India. This arrangement does not make it clear whether how many doses will be made available to India. Now, what is Gavi COVAX? Gavi COVAX is an international collaboration involving the World Health Organization (WHO) and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, that is coordinating the development of several probable vaccines. They have also devised an arrangement to ensure that all countries, irrespective of their wealth, are able to vaccinate a minimum percentage of their population, because there is going to be a competition between countries to access the vaccine, and there is also a competition between countries to develop a vaccine, and that is being called vaccine nationalism. So it covers two things. Number one, to develop a vaccine first, and number two, to get the vaccine which is developed by whosoever first. And the rich countries have already made contracts with all the companies which are in the process of developing these vaccines. So they will ensure that they are the ones, or the rich countries are the ones who get the vaccines first. And it happens in case of every epidemic that ever occurs. It is the rich countries that get the vaccines first. To ensure that low and middle income countries do so, it is currently seeking at least $2 billion in initial seed funding. So let us see how much they get. Now let's move to the next news. Green strategic partnership between India and Denmark. So India and Denmark don't have very elaborate relationships, but now we have entered into a green strategic partnership. So we'll see what is the green strategic partnership all about. Let us begin. India and the Kingdom of Denmark have launched the Green Strategic Partnership for delivering sustainable solutions to India. The Ministry of Commerce and Industry has also signed a MOU for intellectual property cooperation with Denmark. Now, what is this strategic partnership? The partnership will focus on expanding economic ties, green growth, and cooperation on global challenges such as climate change. So, three pillars: expanding economic ties, green growth, and increasing cooperation on global challenges. Green growth is a term to describe a path of economic growth that uses natural resources sustainably, and sustainability is a very, very big thing. And European countries and these Scandinavian countries, they specialize in sustainability. So that is something that they can provide to us. Danish companies with niche technologies and expertise have offered to help India in meeting its air pollution control targets, including in key areas of tackling the problem of burning crop stubble. Now this is very, very important because the environment conditions in North India are getting worse because stubble burning has started, and the Prime Minister is also going to have a meeting with the chief ministers of all the concerned states to address this problem. So let's see what comes out of that problem. And related to this problem, I've made two videos. In one, I've explained the whole problem in detail, why it happens, what are the climatological, what are the policy reasons, right? That basically leads to this problem. Then we also got to know about PUSA antifungal tablets that were there to help in solving this problem, because naturally it takes 45 days for the stubble to biologically degenerate. But with the help of the PUSA fungal tablets, it can happen in 25 days. So this will help. So we also covered that. So you can go back and refer to those videos. Other key points under the partnership include dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and cooperation in water efficiency and water loss. So this is also very important, water efficiency and water loss, we have to tackle it. The creation of India-Denmark energy parks in areas with large numbers of Danish firms and an India-Denmark skill institute to train Indian manpower has been proposed. So more important is 3 areas: economic ties, green growth and global challenges. Then you have to collaborate on economic growth sustainably. Then Danish companies with niche technologies and expertise will help India, and also with water efficiency and water loss. The Green Strategic Partnership will build on existing Joint Commission for Cooperation and existing joint working groups. Now let us also know something about India-Denmark relationship. India and Denmark had signed a joint commission for cooperation in February 2009 for cooperation in politics, economics, commerce, science and technology, energy, environment and education. So these are the regions where we want to cooperate. They have joint working groups on shipping, food, agriculture and fisheries, environment, biotechnology, new and renewable energy and labor mobility. Now these are just the words. You just have to listen to them. If you can retain, well and good, but you don't have to necessarily remember these. Currently, over 140 Danish companies are participating in Make in India initiative. However, the relations got affected due to the non-extradition of the main accused of Purulia arms drop case, Kim Devi, to India by Danish officials. So this was a case, an old case, supposedly to impose president's rule in West Bengal. It was a conspiracy between Mrs. Gandhi and this person, and they basically dropped guns in West Bengal, and then center could step in and say that this is a threat to the unity and integrity of India, so we can impose 356, and then the state government could have been dismissed. But it did not materialize. It snowballed into a political controversy, and this accused was not extradited by the Danish officials to Indian authorities. India has also invited Denmark to join the supply chain resilience. Now this is important because now Prime Minister Modi is repeatedly talking about supply chain resilience, because COVID-19 has shown us that we cannot depend on one source of supply. That is, China was being the global supplier or the global factory, and China controlled the entire world economy, because if anything wrong went in China, it affected the entire world economy. So India is talking about diversifying the global supply chain. So with every partner, India is talking about this point, which is proposed between Japan, Australia, to diversify supply chains and reduce dependence on any one nation, and that one nation is China. And India has much more to gain from this. For example, in yesterday's video, we discussed how leading Apple contractors, or you can say suppliers like Foxconn, are looking to invest $900 million in India under PLI scheme. I told you about the PLI scheme as well. So more and more companies, when they come to India, it will help India. So India is actively working for this initiative. So this is all about this India-Denmark Green Strategic Partnership. Congo fever, another day in 2020 and another new disaster or disease. Now this is Congo fever, and some cases have been reported from some places in Maharashtra. So we'll see what is Congo fever, and it is a very dangerous disease because it has no vaccine and its mortality rate is around 40%. So let's look at it. Congo fever was first discovered in Crimea in 1944 and was named Crimean hemorrhagic fever, and it basically spreads from tick bites. Later in 1969, scientists discovered that the pathogen responsible for causing Crimean hemorrhagic fever and the one that caused illness in Congo in 1956 was the same. Hence the name changed to Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, or CCHF. CCHF is a widespread disease caused by a tick-borne virus, Nairovirus, of the Bunyiaviridae family. Now I have taken some pictures, some infographics, so you take screenshots. I'll tell you about them and you can keep them as your notes. So facts about CCHF. The CCHF virus causes severe viral hemorrhagic fever outbreaks in humans. CCHF outbreaks can cause death of about 40% of the people who get infection. So a very high mortality rate. For coronavirus, it is just 2% or 3% maximum. but for this disease 40%. Now the virus is transmitted to people from ticks and wild and domestic animals and spreads in the human population through human to human transmission. So human to human transmission from animal to human through tick bites, and then human to human transmission through contact with blood, other body secretions or tissues of infected humans or animals. Animals do not show any clinical signs when infected with CCHF, and that is why it is very dangerous, because you do not know which animal is suffering from it, so you become more vulnerable to catching it. CCHF is endemic in Africa, Balkans and Middle East and the Asian region. There is no vaccine available for either people or animals. Now, what are the signs and symptoms? Sudden onset of high fever, headache, back pain, joint pain, abdominal pain, dizziness, neck pain and stiffness. The person has been in contact with a person who has similar symptoms or animals infested with ticks or has had a tick bite. So animals can be both a source of love and joy, and they can also be dangerous. So you have to approach them in a very cautious manner. In addition, the person can have any of the following: nausea, vomiting, and these are the symptoms. You don't have to really get into it. After 2 or 4 days, the patient may experience sleeplessness and depression. So this is also a sign. Now, most of you might be thinking that you are already suffering from it, because these days life has changed for worse and many people are suffering from sleeplessness and depression. Now, how is CCHF transmitted? It is transmitted to people through bites from infected ticks, direct unprotected contact with infected animals during slaughter of animals with ticks attached, direct physical contact with body fluids of a person suffering from CCHF. So all of these diseases are taking humans away from each other. The physical contact is becoming less and less with these diseases. Direct contact with the body of a person who has died of CCHF. How can a person avoid getting CCHF? In order to prevent, you have to check yourself for ticks after working with animals and remove them immediately. Plus, you have to keep away from people who you suspect are suffering from this disease. Again, from this infographic, the CCHF is considered as biosafety level 4 pathogen. So this is the highest level of alert. So it is a biosafety level 4. And the coronavirus, the theory that says it got out from a Chinese lab in Wuhan, that lab was also level 4 lab, that is a lab which is dealing with highly infectious and dangerous viruses and pathogens. With up to 50% fatality rate, in case of nosocomial infection, mortality rate may go up to 80%. So anywhere between 40% to 80% is the mortality rate because of this disease. So let's hope and let's pray that this does not spread. It produces little or no disease in its natural host animals, but causes severe infections in humans. So these are the little points that are important for your PT, that no symptoms or signs in animals, but great harm in humans. Now, from the past, we have already discussed its history, so I'm not going to read that again. The disease is also known as Khungribita, blood taking, and other names in Africa and around the world. Symptoms I've told you, infections in human we've discussed, so just take a screenshot and read it in your leisure time. Way forward, need for awareness programs for people living in close proximity to livestock, training for those working in primary healthcare, rural centers, and better surveillance. So please take screenshot, and this will cover your CCHF. The perils of state overreach. Now this is an editorial from the Hindu, and it has very less of nonsense advice or opinions from the writer. So that is why I have included it here, and it makes some beautiful points about the possible implications of the Vodafone verdict. So I have made a summary for you here. We'll not get into this. I'm just gonna read out the simple points that I've made which are relevant. So he basically points out to 6 major outcomes of this. The author has pointed out to 6 major implications of the judgment. I have written them down and I'll just tell you what they are. So number 1 is that India has to pay. The court has imposed a fine on India to pay for the legal expenses that Vodafone had to incur. So he says that Now India must learn a lesson, all its organs, the judiciary, legislative and the executive, that India must act in accordance with international law or its actions could prove costly. Number 2, India should learn to value the rule of law because this will ensure investor confidence. So whatever the international law is or whatever treaties that we sign, we need to honor them, because what India is doing now, India is unilaterally cancelling all the BITs it had signed earlier. So this shakes investor confidence. So he's saying that we need to learn to value the rule of law, the international laws. That is how the people will come to India and invest in India. Number 3, if India challenges or resists the enforceability of this award of the arbitration court, then it would send a wrong signal to investors, because India would come out as dragging its heels to enforce the decisions of the tribunal, and that would send a wrong message to the investors. Then the 4th is impact on 2 other claims in ISDS, which is the Investor State Dispute Settlement Tribunal. And those 2 cases are Kern and Vedanta. Kern we just discussed, and there's another case of Vedanta, again company from UK, and both are about retrospective tax claims. Then 5th is the decision may increase the anti-ISDS sentiment in India. So there's a sentiment in India, in the policy circles and in the government circle, that this ISDS is favoring other countries over India, and most of its decisions are discriminatory and they do not favor India. So there is already a anti-sentiment. Now it might get strengthened. Then the 6th point and the last point is that this judgment points out to the importance of ISDS in upholding the international rule of law. So these are the 6 points or the 6 implications that the author is talking about in this article, and this is all that you need to know from this. Managing the global commons. Again, this is an editorial from the Hindu. Now this one talks about the concept of global commons, what are they, and the role of local communities and the local self-governance to manage and support the global commons. So I'll just read out the relevant portions to you. Now first he says that when we want to manage the shared resources, we need to balance both private and public interests. Public interest is what? That for example, you're burning coal or you're burning fuel or you're burning a forest, then it can be the interest of a local community or a country, but in the larger realm, it will be hampering the environment of the entire planet. So that is what it is talking about. Now first, let me tell you what is global commons. Global commons refer to shared resources that cannot be managed within international jurisdictions, like air pollution, it is an international problem, water pollution, international problem, the spread of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity reduction, overfishing, and the accumulation of plastic waste are some of the problems within the scope of global commons. Although we have a good idea of what kind of governance might be successful at local community level, these insights do not directly address the challenges we face on a global scale. The consequences of human activities on a global scale are only being recognized in recent times. So see, it is a bidirectional relationship. For example, this is a local community and this is a larger community. Now what this local community does affects the larger community, and also what the larger community does or what it is going through affects the local community. So it is a bidirectional thing. For example, let us say there is a village on the outskirts of any big city and there is agriculture in that village. Now, when the water from the city is polluted, it is drained into the river that may be flowing through the village and its water gets contaminated. Now that disturbs the whole ecology of the village, right? Similarly, let us assume that the village, for example, what we are seeing, stubble burning. So it engages in stubble burning. So the air pollution rises from the village and it disturbs the air quality of the city. So it is a bidirectional relationship, local to global and global to local. Now this author also introduces us to some ideas of some people. In 1968, biologist Garrett Hardin popularized the notion of tragedy of the commons. So this is important for your PT or for your general trivia knowledge, that it was biologist Garrett Hardin that popularized the notion of tragedy of the commons in 1968, which implies that communities cannot manage their shared resources and require governmental interventions to regulate resource use or privatize the resource. Then in 1990, political scientist Elinor Ostrom published her landmark book on governing the commons that demonstrated that communities can govern their own shared resources often better than imposed, well-intended solutions from outside. And she got Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. So you should know these two names for environmentalism. Elinor Ostrom, which talks about managing the global commons and says that local interventions are better than the global or the interventions that are imposed from above, and The Tragedy of Commons by biologist Garrett Hardin. So this is the relevant part from this article, nothing more to know. So folks, this is all for this video. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel and please press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. Also, please press the like button if you liked our video, and please do connect with us on our Instagram page UPSC for Everyone. See you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.